I'm joined online by Professor Henning Melber, of course, from the Nordic Institute of Africa. He's a professor in Pretoria, but has also has a long-standing history in as far as the political or the geopolitical history of Namibia is concerned, being a member, of course, of the Swapo Party for close to 5 decades. Professor Henning, thank you so much for making time out to join us. Welcome.
Thank you, Ricardo, and good day to you and the viewers, albeit on a very sad occasion.
Professor, of course, before we get into the official conversation around politics, etc., I just want you to briefly reflect on how you heard, how did the news reach you, and what were some of your initial reaction to this news?
Well, actually, the first one who informed me was at 5 o'clock on Sunday morning, Turimo Hangari, who sent me a WhatsApp message. So I was in the picture when I woke up to the sad news. And then I received maybe 10 or 15 messages on WhatsApp from people I'm still in contact with locally in Namibia.
What are some of your first encounters with the late Dr. Hage Geingob? When was the first time you met and under which conditions?
I met him first when he was the director of the United Nations Institute in Lusaka in 1980. I was then involved together with Nangolo Mbumba in drafting a social studies textbook for use at the Swapo refugee camps in exile. And since then, I've been on and off in touch with Comrade Hage, especially so when I returned to Namibia from exile and was, as a successor to Peter Katjavivi, the director of the Namibian Economic Policy Research Unit, NEPRU, between 1992 and 2000. Hage was then the prime minister, and we interacted because NEPRU, as the local think tank, had the task and mandate to offer policy advice to the government.
Let's look at some of those early days as well, of course. First, just focusing a little bit at UNIN before we come to your days at NEPRU. What was his leadership style like as the director of UNIN, and what were some of the visions and ambitions he had during the time for the cadres that were being trained there, particularly in context of getting them ready to lead government of independent Namibia in the future one day?
Hage's leadership style then was not very different from what it was more recently and why he is so much popular among the Namibians. He was jovial, he was caring, he was easily interacting. I remember he used to spend the breaks at lunch in the yard of the institute, chatting with students who were standing around him, and very lively interacting with them. More actually than any other staff, as far as I remember. He was then already a man of the people. He was looking to have direct exchange, conversations, making jokes, sometimes, if I dare to say, borderline jokes where you think, is that really funny? He thinks it's funny, but those he is joking with not necessarily shared the same humor or thought that's a joke on their costs or expenses. Like he once made me look like a fool in front of several students and thought it was funny. I didn't think it was funny at all. But that was the Hage. He remained all his life easygoing, jovial, always up for a lighter note, interacting, enjoying life also in the highest offices he occupied.
But in terms of this, now, of course, we come into post-independence, 1990, 1992. You're taking over now the Namibia Economic Policy Research Unit, NEPRU, of course, doing economic analysis on that. Reflect a little bit on some of the major policy outlooks and the thinking that the president had during the time as prime minister in your tenure at NEPRU.
First of all, he was a very proactive prime minister in the sense of permanently checking out what are the issues that are of relevance and the office needs to engage with. He called for several special conferences. For example, I remember vividly he had in the late 1990s a conference preceding the establishment of the Office of the Anti-Corruption Commission, where he had a consultation with academics, with policymakers, inviting also foreigners to talk on how best to tackle the challenges of corruption in the country. I remember another one of these conferences. They usually were taking place in the Safari Court Hotel, which now is, as this name says, history. But another one was the Prime Minister's office interacting with scholars on academic freedom and the role of academia in policy advice. So he was not only following a narrowly defined line of agenda setting, he was always having an open mind, scouting, trying to get inputs from a wide spectrum of society.
What we know, of course, during the time as well, particularly after the advent of independence, there was always conversations around the economic freedom. And we know that a lot of the populist movements would say that, listen, we need to look at land expropriation, we need to look at nationalizing a lot of sectors, etc. But I understand he was quite a vivid supporter for a mixed economy. Talk to us a little bit about his approach to the economy and not being too fundamentalist on either side of thinking when it comes to economic theory.
He was foremost a pragmatist, pursuing what he considered the best interests for Namibia. And the best interests of Namibia means to walk a tight act in international politics, being confronted with global asymmetric power relations, with different actors seeking control in their relations, in the bi- and multilateral relations with other countries, mainly those countries perceived to be weaker, quote unquote, in the sense that they did not have the weight the big powers had. That is a very difficult balancing act. And when Namibia became independent, it was very obvious with the end of the Cold War that this is not the time of socio-economic revolutions. It's more the time to seek a continuity, to seek national reconciliation, and to provide stability. And this credit goes to all three presidents who were in office since independence, that they managed to administer and guide the country in an unusual, stable way compared with other countries on the continent. I usually refer to Namibia with pride by saying, since independence has not been a single politically motivated killing in almost 34 years. If you compare that with other countries, that's amazing. And similarly, stability played a role in the economic positioning of the country. Namibia is very dependent on the world market with its commodities, mainly in the mineral sector, fisheries, and now, of course, also with tourism, where stability again comes into the picture. So these were the assets to be protected. And you protect them by not taking unnecessary risks and trying to seek the best interests with multiple partners. That means you are not turning a back on the West, even if you don't like the Western double standards, but you are also not taking a strong side against Russia or China. And this is a balancing act which Hage Geingob managed to play very well, despite the odd outbursts of frustration and anger directed towards the West, and most recently, as we know, towards Germany for taking a stand in favor of Israel's genocidal warfare in Gaza.
Professor, if we look at it, of course, we've known that the foreign policy approach generally of Namibia has been an independent foreign policy approach, but more with being part of the non-alignment movement, being a friend of all countries. But despite that, we've seen that the president had also taken some strong stances, principally on a number of issues, particularly, like you've mentioned now, the issue around the support for Palestine and the support for Western Sahara as well. Talk to us about his ability to be able to do that despite saying that, look, we are part of the non-alignment movement, we are a friend of all, but in terms of on positions of principles on this particular issues, we are not budging.
If you pursue fundamental values as principles, you end in constellations where it's impossible to be a friend of all. You didn't mention another very important subject close to Namibian leaders at heart. That's the sanctions against Cuba, which was one of the closest allies and supporters during the liberation struggle. So there you take a stance in all those cases, and this stance is necessarily directed in different directions. In those three particular cases, it's an anti-Western position you are taking. Unfortunately, if I may add, double standards prevail not only among the West. While Namibia treasures its self-determination, territorial integrity, and national sovereignty, it remained silent when it came to Russian invasion of the Ukraine. Despite the fact that the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union and likewise as Russia in support of our liberation struggle. The personal medical doctor of Tatekulu Semnuyoma was trained not in Moscow but in Kiev. But notwithstanding that shared history, Namibia failed to take a stance in the violation of self-determination and sovereignty of the Ukraine. I think that highlights the difficulties, even if you are non-aligned, to position yourself in a way where you are always speaking truth to power and remain loyal to fundamental principles and values.
Let's look at a little bit also, of course, particularly since you're talking about that on multilateralism and our approach to that as well. I mean, the president has always maintained that Namibia is a child of international solidarity. We know, of course, our legal system has been to take a monist approach in terms of our international law, where all of major global treaties that we're signing on human rights and the protection of rights and freedoms must automatically be domesticated. And we have sort of used that also when we're interpreting our local laws to maintain the support for human rights here in Namibia as well. Reflect a little bit on our relationship with multilateral organizations and multilateralism.
As you rightly pointed out, Ricardo, Namibian independence was to some extent also the result of the United Nations system being the midwife in the transition to independence. Hage Geingob was the most classical result of that negotiated transition. While he was still a member of the first struggle generation, he was to some extent an outlier because as from the mid-1960s, he already represented Swapo at the United Nations. And as we already talked about, he was then the director of the United Nations Institute in Lusaka as a high United Nations official. Upon return, he was the chairperson of the Constituent Assembly, and I'm sure you have already mentioned and talked about that, where he played the decisive role in adopting the constitutional principles. Hage Geingob was very much an integral part of an international diplomatic system which supported Namibian independence. So that, of course, also contributed to his approach to global issues, to his diplomacy. And it was very visible in his ability to appear in a positive sense on very different international floors and contexts. That is one of the things, also on the background of his high formal education. After all, he achieved a PhD. Before that, he did a master's and a bachelor's at US American universities and a PhD at Sheffield University in the UK. So he had the abilities to be well articulated, to be able to read the language of the others, no matter on which background they were talking. And he was able to respond adequately and sophisticated. That are very important positive attributes to represent a country internationally, diplomatically, as he did so well as the head of state.
And in terms of that, of course, on that representation, you had mentioned just now also another aspect of him that I wanted to ask you about, which was, of course, Geingob, the academic, well-educated man, has put together, of course, his PhD as well. And the reason why I wanted to ask about Geingob, the academic, is also because if we look at this idea of the Namibian house, was also articulated in his PhD, and a vision that he took from that, and of course brought when he became president to sort of make or materialize this whole idea of a Namibian house and us working together for the development of this particular house. Can you briefly reflect on Geingob, the academic, for us?
Yes, and I would like to start with the metaphor of the Namibian house, because I think that was a very relevant and important transition from the previous official narrative, which the two predecessors of him in the office as head of state cultivated. Until then, the equation we had during the struggle days, that Swapo is the nation and the nation is Swapo, was still translated in a kind of dominant political culture at home since independence. The mantra of the Namibian house replaced that equation by an all-embracing concept, because in his inauguration speech in 2015, he explained that the Namibian house provides space for all and that no one should be left behind. So it was not any longer the reductionist approach that Swapo is the nation and the nation is Swapo, which by definition would mean if you're not Swapo, you're not part of the nation. The Namibian house was a different reference point. And I think it also highlights his ability to analyze and to conceptualize and to be a visionary. And maybe unconsciously, this approach made him so popular while executing office, despite all the criticism he received on certain issues during his terms in the office, which includes me as one of the very vocal critics of certain government policies and failures. But it speaks to Geingob that he perceived a vision despite the limitations of implementing the vision during his times in office.
Of course, Professor Henning, you've of course been a member of the Swapo Party, I think close to 5 decades now. But one of the defining features and characteristics that many were saying about Geingob was his ability to be able to reach across different political aisles and still be able to garner consensus on major decisions concerning the development of the state of Namibia as we know it. Can you just reflect on that part of his character, that ability to be able to speak across different political aisles with particular reference to the negotiations of the Constituent Assembly in 1990?
Hage Geingob was integrative. He was aware that if you want to achieve something, you need to take as many people on board as possible, even if that requires compromises which you not necessarily always like or are fond of. And his proposal in the Constituent Assembly was a classical example of that, which marked a decisive turn in the deliberations. It was Hage Geingob who submitted to the Constituent Assembly that the fundamental principles which were designed by the Western Contact Group in the early 1980s would be adopted as principal clauses in the Constitution. That made a total difference because from that moment on, the antagonistic rivalry between Swapo and the other members of the Constituent Assembly ceased. All of a sudden, you had a total compromise, and not a single vote was against that proposal and afterwards against the adoption of the Constitution. That was a fantastic act of diplomacy he achieved. It came at a price. Many are not necessarily very happy about certain constitutional principles, but looking at it in a positive way, it was at the time the most liberal and progressive constitution adopted, with fundamental clauses protecting and promoting civil liberties and human rights. That's quite a lot to be achieved.
And looking at that and still staying with that, reflecting on that a little bit, Professor, we also see in terms of how the Constitution had been put together, many were hailing it and saying, we are not only speaking about first-generation rights, but we also included already the so-called second-generation and third-generation rights, including the protection of the environment to a certain extent as well. Talk to us about the progressiveness of that assembly and being able to put all these different views together. I understand there were 7 different drafts of the Constitution before the one was adopted that Swapo brought to the table?
Well, first of all, Hage Geingob was the one who constantly emphasized that the Constitution is a living document and that it's a guiding principle and lasting reference point. Something which Nangolo Bumba now, as his successor, repeatedly stressed again and reminded the public on different occasions since the few days in office. Like any other constitution, the Namibian constitution has a certain degree of discrepancy between what is there and ensured and what is implemented. Social realities look different from the ideal of a constitution. Despite the fact that the constitution recognizes and promotes natural environment protection, socio-economic emancipation of the population, which Hage Geingob also reiterated through his Harambee Prosperity Plan, we are aware that natural environment in Namibia is not only at risk through climate change, which is an external factor no government can influence, but also through certain ways of exploiting the natural resources. We know that not all human rights, which one could read into the Constitution, are sufficiently respected. The latest case has been the ruling of the Supreme Court when it came to the equal rights of 2 spouses, foreign spouses married to Namibian citizens in same-sex relations, where the National Assembly strongly reacted to and drafted a bill which seeks to bypass that ruling of the court. Notably, Hage Geingob has not signed that bill while he was in office. So it also means, and it shows as one of several examples, that he was very aware of what the Constitution in an ideal way and reading has in mind and where the limitations are in social realities. The same can be said about the adoption of reproductive rights, where Namibia, and I was proud to be a member of the delegation in Cairo in Egypt in late 1993, was one of the promoters of adopting reproductive rights, meaning giving women more decision-making power over their bodies. Unfortunately, looking at the abortion laws, among others, this is something where Namibia has not lived up to the catalogue of rights which are identified in reproductive rights. But again, it simply illustrates, like in any other country, that there is a discrepancy between constitutional principles, normative values ratified in international conventions, and the realities on the ground. But Hage Geingob was the one who never lost sight of the Constitution.
If we look at it, of course, this also brings me to the question around his intentional work to make sure that the judiciary of the country remains independent, and of course that separation of the three different branches of government. Can you just reflect a little bit on that as well? Because you've seen during his tenure as well, there were some major cases that government had also lost to foreign companies and other political players, of course, also here in the country. But he had maintained that respect for an independent judiciary. Reflect a little bit on that for us.
That's very true, Ricardo, and it's one of the achievements one needs to give credit to Hage Geingob. He was in strong support of the rule of law and an independent judiciary. As I mentioned, Ngolo Bumba stressed this as one of the outstanding achievements of Hage Geingob and of Namibia as a democratic multi-party state. The government respected rulings of the Supreme Court, abided by them despite being of a different opinion, with the one example I just mentioned that might be an exemption. And Hage Geingob was very well aware that this is one of the most positive assets to show off to the world, that Namibia abides to the rule of law in the country at all times, to the effect that he was willing to accept things he personally most likely didn't like. Another example is the freedom of the media, the press freedom. We know that Hage was not always very tolerant when it came to being criticized. But he was never, ever tempted to infringe on the freedom of the independent media in the country. He was proud and bragged that Namibia is the most media-free country in the continent, and in the last ranking of Reporters Without Borders, Namibia was just one place behind Germany and several places ahead of the United Kingdom and even more places ahead of the USA. I'm very sure that Hage was thrilled about that ranking, and he would have done everything to protect the independence and the freedom of the media, despite the fact that the media in Namibia were not shy of using their power as an independent watchdog to be at times very critical, sometimes even unfair in the way they treated him, the party, and the government.
Dr. Melber, thank you, Professor Melber, thank you so much for making time out to join us. But before I let you go, just the final one from your end. How will you personally remember Dr. Hage Geingob, and perhaps how do we as a country carry forward the legacy that he's leaving behind? What kind of legacy is he leaving behind?
Well, first of all, on a personal note, learning about his passing on triggered a reaction, emotional reaction in me, like I would assume many other Namibians I had not been aware of. From the moment I was aware that he is not any longer among us, I realized how much he was part of my life and how much I will miss him. So, as a legacy in more abstract terms, not those personal, emotional ones, I think he personified the liberal, open-minded, but still politically loyal course of a Swapo government, which joined the world as a democratic state in protection of human rights. And I'm very glad to see from the first statements of Nangolo Bumba that he very much follows the same trajectory.
Thank you very much, Professor, for making time out to join us this morning.
Thank you.
We have a Professor Henning Melber from the Nordic Institute for Africa. Of course, he always mentioned how he's been a member of the Swapo Party since 1979. And of course, he's a professor in Pretoria and has reflected, of course, on the economic policies of the president, even to the point of criticizing many of those since 1992 to 2000 when he was the director of the then Namibia Economic Policy Research Unit. Of course, a professor